So we are going to look at transport of materials in living organisms. We'll start by looking at transport uh, in animals, and then we shall look at transport in plants. But of course, the mechanisms of transport, whether in plants or in animals, or even in smaller organisms, that, for example, the amoeba, these processes are basically the same. And we shall say that these processes fall under two categories. But first of all, we look at a question here, and that question is about a hiker who is trekking through a dry, hot environment and then develops signs of dehydration and muscle fatigue. Medical personnel explain that loss of water and ions affect cell transport processes, especially in the kidneys and muscles. Now, the questions that we have are that, can we explain why multicellular organisms like human beings require complex transport systems? And then the other question is, can you describe the process of osmosis and how it affects cells during dehydration? And then the third question is, state two ways the body attempts to maintain water balance during dehydration, and then explain how active transport helps the kidneys to reabsorb essential ions from the filtrate. Now, this question here introduces different concepts, and the concepts are the concept of water balance as exemplified by the concept of dehydration. Okay, so dehydration is when you don't have sufficient water in your body. So you basically, if your body is not having sufficient water, you are likely to feel thirsty, and then you need to drink water to basically rehydrate yourself. Okay, so that is the concept of water balance. And then the other concept that comes with it is a concept of ion balance also. So when we talk about water in the body, we usually also talk about mineral ions, because the movement of water is actually affected by the concentration of these ions. Okay, so that is the second concept. And then the third concept is an issue of transport. So with the issue of transport in this question, we are basically looking at how these ions actually move, what mechanisms actually help in movement of these ions. And that is why the fourth question is about active transport. So this therefore means that we are integrating homeostasis, which is an issue to do with maintaining balance of the internal environment. That is, whether it is water, whether it is ions, or even other minerals or organic compounds, or even hormones. And then the other concept that we are looking at is the concept to do with the transport, where we are talking about active transport. Okay, and then the last concept that we are basically looking at is a concept to do with size of organisms, and what challenges does size pose to organisms. And that is why we have a question to do with why humans require a complex transport system, while microscopic organisms actually don't need. And that is question one. So you really see that this question requires us to integrate knowledge from different topics. Okay. But of course, our focus is on transport. And we are basically saying that when we are dealing with the transport, we are looking at how materials move within the organism, or how the materials move into the organism and then out of the organism. So those are three things. We have internal movement of materials, okay, and then we have exchange of material between the organism and the environment. Okay, so that is internal mechanisms and then external transport mechanisms. This all comes from the fact that within an organism, you need materials. And what materials are those? These materials are basically ions, hormones, nutrients, proteins, of course, nutrients. We have proteins, amino acids, we have lipids, and many others. Okay, and then we have oxygen and carbon dioxide. These fall under gases, and then we also have waste products. So when we talk about materials, these are the things that we are basically talking about. Okay, so that means that if you have a well-developed transport system, that transport system is concerned with this transport of these things that I've just mentioned. Okay, transportation of oxygen and the nutrients, transportation of waste and products, transportation of hormones, transportation of even antibodies, and many other things. Okay, and that is why transport is actually very important. Okay, so the mechanisms of transport in organisms are basically two broad mechanisms. These mechanisms are one, active transport. When we say active in biology, we are referring to the fact that a process requires ATP, which is the form of energy. Okay, so if you say active cells, active tissues, we are basically saying that these tissues are respiring and they're basically producing ATP. If you say this is an active process, basically means that that process requires ATP. So active transport, the type of transport where ATP is used, and this is basically because the movement is against the concentration gradient. That means that you are moving materials from an area of low concentration to an area of higher concentration. That's what we mean by against the concentration gradient. And that is why ATP is actually needed. And glucose is basically absorbed using active transport, including mineral salts. Again, for passive, which is the second broad category, is the type of transport where you don't need ATP because the transportation is along the concentration gradient. That means that you're moving materials from where they are highly concentrated to where there is low concentration. Okay, and of course, for each of these, we have the different types. Okay, active transport, for example, we have talked about uptake of glucose in the intestines, that is absorption of glucose. But when we talk about passive transport, we are talking about osmosis and then diffusion. And of course, we also know that we have facilitated diffusion. So we have facilitated diffusion, simple diffusion, osmosis, and then mass flow. Okay. So the issue is that for very small organisms, basically unicellular organisms, for them they don't need complex transport systems just because for them the distance that is required for these materials, the distance for these materials to move is actually very, very short. So therefore diffusion and osmosis can actually be sufficient. But for higher organisms, or basically complex organisms, including humans, these materials have to move long distances, and therefore diffusion alone or diffusion and other processes like osmosis may not be sufficient to move these materials from one part of the body to the other. So that means that there is need to have a developed transport system to move these things. Okay. The fact that you have an organism that is actually very, very small, it means that this small organism has a large surface area to volume ratio, and therefore diffusion can actually be sufficient for them to get to what they need. And that is not true for multicellular organisms. Multicellular organisms definitely do not have a large surface area to volume ratio. Okay, so we earlier on talked about mass transport. It is basically a concept to do with how materials can move in bulk because of the pressure differences between where they are moving from to where they are going. So if, of course, they are moving from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure, that's all that entire movement of a lot of this material is what we term as mass flow. Okay, so what we see in the phloem and the xylem is basically mass flow, and again in the blood circulatory system, where we have blood moving from one part of the body to the other, that is also mass flow. It's the same thing that happens in other systems like the alimentary canal and also the respiratory system. Okay, so coming back to our question, the question basically, like we said earlier on, that it requires us to understand that transport mechanisms are quite important in multicellular organisms because of the fact that multicellular organisms have this very small surface area to volume ratio, and therefore they cannot rely on diffusion, and that is why an elaborate transport system is required. Okay, and then osmosis is one of the passive mechanisms of transport. That means it doesn't require any form of ATP or any form of energy. So no energy is required for osmosis, and for it you have basically movement of water molecules from one area of low solute concentration to an area of high solute concentration across a semi-permeable membrane. So that is what osmosis is. The point here is that when you are dehydrated, it means that the solute concentration actually increases in the cells. Just imagine you are basically having a cell, and that cell is losing water. Okay, when you are dehydrated, your cells are basically losing water. They're not having sufficient water. So that means that the solute concentration in your cells is going to be very, very, very high. Okay, and ideally, if you have sufficient water and you have more solids in your cells, it means that the water will move into the cells, okay, because of the high solid concentration through the process of osmosis. That is what would happen. Okay, but in this case, you're not having sufficient water, and therefore you're basically dehydrated, and you're having a situation of the cells having high solid concentration. Okay, and then of course, if you are dehydrated, the body tries to make sure that you drink water, so you feel thirsty, and then if there is water, you go and drink water, and then that water is basically reabsorbed. Okay, and then also that the kidneys, if you're dehydrated, the kidneys will not produce a lot of urine. So the kidneys will basically reabsorb much of the water such that you produce very concentrated little urine. And that's what happens to in order to compensate for the water that you are basically lacking. Okay. And then for the active transport, you will need some of these ions not to be lost through the urine. And therefore, active transport helps in absorbing some of these essential ions from the filtrate. Thank you.